Welcome everyone to this two-part webinar on exploring legal restrictions when reporting on violence against women, presented by Our Watch and RMIT Centre of Innovative Justice. I would like to open the session today by acknowledging the traditional custodians and owners of the lands across Australia on which we work and live. For me and Naarm, this is the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people. Our Watch acknowledges the ongoing impacts of colonisation, racism and discrimination on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and the decades-long advocacy for safety, truth-telling and justice by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples past and present and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining this session today. So my name is Rebecca Hayden and I am the Media Implementation Lead at Our Watch, working with journalists around their reporting on violence against women. Our Watch is a national leader in preventing violence against women and their children in Australia. We work with businesses, governments and communities to drive long-term cultural change where people live, work and socialise, including media, workplaces, universities, TAFEs and sporting organisations. The RMIT Centre for Innovative Justice researches, advocates and applies innovative ways to improve the justice system, with a particular focus on therapeutic jurisprudence, restorative justice and non-adversarial dispute resolution. Journalists play a powerful role in shaping public understanding of violence against women, but when legal restrictions apply, there are additional challenges in reporting responsibly and accurately while centering the voices and safety of those affected. We hope this webinar will equip you with the tools you need to navigate some of the legal and ethical considerations to cover these stories in a trauma-informed manner. The first part of our two-part webinar will explore how legal narratives and court processes can unintentionally reinforce victim blaming and the impacts when these narratives are replicated in the media, how the criminal justice system could be improved to make the process less traumatic on victim survivors, how to report on victim survivors in a responsible and trauma-informed manner, and finally, the gap between what courts commonly deal with and what the media reports, and why this matters for public understanding. We will then have a 15-minute break before the second part of our webinar, which will explore how legal restrictions in Australia impact on reporting, some practical strategies for navigating these, and the ethical dimensions of court reporting. Now, we know that violence against women is widespread and touches the lives of many people. We acknowledge that the content discussed today may be emotionally challenging, and you may want to chat with someone following our session today. You can contact 1800-RESPECT, and there are also services for men seeking support about relationships, anger or mental health. You can contact the Men's Referral Service on 1300 766 491, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can also contact 13 Yarn. QLife provides support to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender diverse and intersex people. These links and support services are in the chat along with our code of conduct for today's session. And if you would have a question you would like the panelists to answer, please use the Q&A function at any time and indicate who the question is for, and we'll address these in the Q&A towards the end of the panel session. So now we're going to move into our panel discussion. We have an impressive group of panelists today, bringing diverse yet complementary expertise and experience. I would first like to introduce the moderator for this panel, Elena Campbell. Elena Campbell is a trained lawyer, consultant and researcher who's worked in legal and social policy for 25 years. As Associate Director at the Centre for Innovative Justice at RMIT University, she oversees a program of research regarding domestic, family and sexual violence and the related impacts on people's experiences of justice and service systems. Over to you, Elena.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And it's fantastic, really fantastic to be here. I very much appreciate the ongoing focus from Our Watch on continuing to recognise the importance and complexity of the media's obligations in reporting violence against women and children, and in doing so seeking to improve the way in which the experiences of victims and survivors of gender-based violence, as well as their families and communities, are understood. So it's fantastic to be here for the first of two vital sessions today. And I'll take us to our fantastic panel in a moment, including by asking them to introduce themselves in the way that they prefer, noting that everyone joining the session will see their very impressive bios in the chat. But first, I similarly want to acknowledge that we all join from stolen lands today. And for me today, it's the very sunny lands of the language groups of the Boonwurrung and Wirringa people of the Eastern Kulin Nations in Victoria. But wherever we are, I want to acknowledge the strengths and ongoing leadership of First Nations communities all around Australia in preventing and addressing violence against women and children. And I also want to recognise the profound systems harm and intergenerational trauma that converges with the topic of our conversations today, to mean that media reporting in this area is particularly laden with responsibility and a considerable opportunity to do better. So we'll jump into the conversation now. And as I said, I'll ask the panel to introduce themselves in the context of the first question that they answer. There's a lot to cover and there won't be answers to all of the relevant challenges and questions here today, but combined with the second session, we hope that it can help those in the audience feel inspired to find a way forward and find the courage to engage in more depth with victim survivor stories. So we're actually still waiting on one of our panel members, Zita, and we hope that she'll be able to join us in a minute. So first of all, I'm going to throw to you, Anna, in a minute to think about what it looks like and what it means when the voices of victims and survivors and their families are essentially not included in the coverage of when we see gender-based violence prosecuted in the criminal legal system. And I want to ask you, what have you noticed about, what happens when journalists and media more generally are sort of grappling with the conception that they might have that they can't share a victim's voice due to the relevant legal restrictions? And what's the effect of that? What sort of things do survivors notice about the language that's used? And what do survivors notice about what the effect is when media reports on victim survivor stories without including their direct experience? Remember to introduce yourself in the way you would most like.
Yep, start with an introduction. My name's Anna. I live on beautiful Wirringa country in Broken Hill, and I've lived here for a couple of years now. I work here as a social worker in the Aboriginal Medical Service. I'm the director and co-founder of the Survivor Hub, which is a survivor-led charity aiming to support, inform and empower people impacted by sexual violence. And the way we do that is through peer support groups that we call meetups. And we have them in various states and territories across the country now. It's actually getting to a point where there's too many to name, which is very exciting. I think we have about 15 locations, and then we also have online and some experience-specific groups as well. And in answering your question, I think I can go immediately to some conversations that we've had in some meetups about this. And when we see really high profile like celebrity cases, such as very famously maybe Amber Heard, but also sometimes when we have like footy players and people like that who are in the news for being accused and sometimes found guilty and sentenced for sexual, domestic and family violence. And you see in your social media feeds, everybody sees it. They see things like, what's she gaining from this? The people are calling these women names. They're saying that they're lying. They're saying that they've got something to gain from this. And aside from what to me is the very obvious fact that you don't gain anything from being a victim survivor, and you definitely don't gain anything from going through the court process, and particularly not so publicly like was the case for Amber Heard and for so many of these really high profile things. Those sorts of comments Amber Heard doesn't read them, and hopefully people in Amber Heard's circle don't read them either. The people who read them are the survivors in your life, your family members, your friends, for some people, your partner, your children. Those are the people who read the comments when people are commenting, saying, you know, something about gaining and all these lies and myths that people like to make up about survivors when they go through the court process. It's not those people who are reading the comments, it's the survivors in your life who are reading them. And the very real and devastating impact of that is that people are so much less likely to then access support and go through, if they want to, the legal and court process, because they know what the people in their lives think about people who do go through that process, and they have a very real fear that they won't be believed if they do go through that process.
And Anna, just as sort of a follow-up reflection, you and I in different contexts have talked about that the fact that often the primary reason that survivors might have reported or gone forward with a prosecution once they have reported is to stop the violence from happening to someone else. So I would imagine that it's also not just about discouraging people reporting and from an individual perspective, but that the more women are shamed or stigmatised and see this playing out in the way things are reported in the media, the less we will actually prevent future violence. What would be your reflections on that?
And how hurtful it is to go into for what is for most people the most traumatic experience they can go through, to go through the court process. How hurtful to go through that process and to be accused of doing it for personal gain. You know, as you say, you do that because you know, you might want to stop the person from doing it to other people, or you do it because you think it's the right thing to do, or you think that you need to protect other people that they've already harmed or that they may harm in the future. And so you go into it with, you know, very, you know, good and often altruistic reasons, and then to see in the media and to see in social media commentary that you have something that you can gain from going through that, whether that's fame or money or whatever it is that they're being accused of getting, which they don't get, is insulting and very harmful, and, you know, as you say, stops people from going through that process and stops people from doing what they need to do in their healing and recovery process.
Fantastic, thanks, Anna. Christine, as CEO of Wirringa Baiya Aboriginal Legal Centre for over 20 years, what have you noticed in particular about the way in which First Nations victims and survivors or their families are either portrayed, what sort of, you know, language or framing is used when that happens, or when they're actually missing from the narrative altogether?
Thank you, Elena. Yeah, so you've already said who I am, but Christine Robinson from Wirringa Baiya Aboriginal Women's Legal Centre, and I'm a Bundjalung woman. I'm on the land of the Gubbi Gubbi people today, but I would like to, you know, just acknowledge everyone in this space today. I think one of the things that what, you know, we see, because I have been working at Wirringa Baiya for 20 years, but I've been working in the sector for over 30. So looking at the changes during that time, and they're not much has changed in this space, if anything. What we're looking at is when it comes to Aboriginal parties, we pretty much get ignored in this space in media. Like on many occasions, it doesn't reach the front page. The only time it's usually normalised or it's something to be expected, like domestic violence within Aboriginal communities or perpetrated one Aboriginal person against another, is seen as you know, something that happens within Aboriginal communities. It's the norm. That it also opens that lens of whether or not it's discrimination and racism, that stereotypical attitude, thinking that, you know, violence within communities is something that happens within communities and leave it there. You know, that's like that old saying that, you know, something happens in community, it stays in community. Well, you know, things have changed, and things have changed over the years where Aboriginal women and victims of violence are speaking out more. So trying to get that recognition within society is really difficult. I think, for instance, I'll just refer to information about the police, for instance. We know of women that report domestic violence or ringing up the police, and the police may not turn up for a couple of hours, or they may not turn up for a couple of days, or they may not turn up at all, depending on what location the incidents occurred in. So when you look at the lack of responses in society, it's sort of indicative of how Aboriginal women feel in this space, particularly when it comes to dealing with violence and reporting it, but how they're also perceived by the media and perceived by society. I think that's a really big concern that it sort of impacts on us today. And I think, Anna's already touched on it, but the media portrayal of women in particular when it comes to violence, but then Aboriginal women are lower on that scale. So, one of the things is that we also often think that Aboriginal women, if it is covered by the media, it's often generally covered in a deficit, with a deficit focus. It's not talking about the strengths or her achievements or what she's done. It talks about, well, she was, she's a substance, she uses substances, she's been incarcerated, she's had her children removed. It's all of those really negative, those negative sort of narratives that come with the victim of violence. And I think that's one of those really important things that need to change, that we need to identify victims as victims of violence rather than unpacking what their lifestyle is or their choices are or what's happened to them. I think we know that statistics for Aboriginal women and domestic violence are very high. However, Aboriginal women in particular are very invisible when it comes to the media and the violence. And, we do not, we don't consider that we receive the same recognition, acknowledgement, and on occasions the same level of sympathy or empathy that non-Aboriginal women get. So, there's a difference as well when we look at the media attention that may be, sometimes we see if the perpetrator is Aboriginal and the victim is non-Aboriginal or is white, we see that there'll be a media lens around that. We saw that more recently, even though it wasn't domestic violence, but we see that happen on occasions where the perpetrator, because they're Aboriginal, they will hit the front page because of that situation. But when the Aboriginal woman is the victim and the non-Aboriginal person or the white person is the perpetrator, is the male perpetrator, what we see is most of the time there'll be a narrative around the Aboriginal woman, being angry, aggressive, being, was responding, was, violent or was abusive when he would be attacking her. And if police turn up, they're also, they may be aggressive to the police. So, there's a thing that we call about the angry Black woman. It's that scenario or that situation that, it's just recognised that, we're just painted in a different way or we're viewed in a different way. And I think what we need to start looking at is the reason why a lot of women do become angry and do become frustrated in those situations, because when you're reaching out for help and when you're reaching out and you're not getting a response from anyone, whether or not the police, the legal system or services that are there to support you, and then the media portrays Aboriginal women in a negative light, well, that I'm not saying that's that's an excuse, but I do understand it to be a contributing factor in why these things do happen. I know that many women's cases are reported unfairly. Many women, like all women, their cases are reported unfairly and questionable. And sometimes there's that element of reporting a victim of violence as a bad victim or a good victim. And usually those ones that are reported as a good victim are the non-Aboriginal women, because it's a different space. They talk about all the positives and they talk about this woman was such a community person or she was a good mum, and so they will paint her in a different light to what they will with an Aboriginal woman. I'm not saying that all Aboriginal women have those issues or those backgrounds around substance abuses. I've known none of other cases where Aboriginal women have been quite, have been strong leaders in their communities and still not have had the recognition that they've been killed as a victim.
Thanks so much, Christine.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. No, thank you. They were just such a powerful reflection on really what it is involved when there is a lack of voice, specifically from the victim and or their family and community. And when, as you say, there's essentially narrative or coverage about the victim and drawing on those really kind of incredibly harmful tropes and assumptions that go forward. So, and Zita's on the call now, which is fantastic, and I'll throw to you in a minute, Zita, but I'll give you a second to catch your breath. And throwing to Anna now, just thinking about, we've just been sort of talking about what happens when the voice of or the experience of the victim or survivor is absent from that coverage. But then moving now to the kind of experience or phenomenon where there is kind of essentially coverage drawing from the victim survivors or survivors' experience during the coverage of the prosecution process, but where it might, have not particularly pan out as you might expect. So, Anna, as a survivor who has showing characteristic guts and grace, gone through that incredibly traumatizing criminal legal process yourself, what were some of the things that surprised you about what journalists could report or the information that they could obtain when they were trying to share your story?
Well, just listening to Christine just now, that threw me right back into what it was like being in court and having media reporting in court at the same time. And I'd been told that a closed court meant that there weren't people there and that people wouldn't know, and that I had some privacy and some confidentiality. And then I remember, I think I was cross-examined for 4 or 5 days, and I remember on the second day that someone had texted me and said, "Don't look at the news." And I was like, well, okay, now I'm going to look at the news. And I didn't realize that the media were allowed to report verbatim quotes from my evidence. And so I remember clicking through these really horrible news articles where they'd used exactly my words, quote for quote, about my testimony on what had happened to me. And then also remember the descriptions of him, like how small he was and how he was trembling and how he looked terrified and things like that when I was giving evidence. And I was just shocked because I'd been told that it was closed and that meant that I had privacy, and obviously I didn't. And the media had obviously not contacted me or my family or anybody, the police or anybody in the case, to let us know that they were going to be reporting my quotes. So that was obviously very devastating, and also to be in the middle of giving evidence, still right in the middle of it, and to have to read that and then kind of think, okay, well, when I go back to court tomorrow, which words am I not going to use, and what should I be saying instead to make sure that that doesn't get quoted, because how embarrassing is that? I don't want people knowing about this, and things like that was horrific. And then my other sort of piece of media was I very reluctantly agreed to do an Australian Story episode because I thought that it would be good for awareness for our charity, for the Survivor Hub, and I was really embarrassed about it, and it took me about a year and a bit to agree to do it. But when I did agree to do it, we went through the kind of the early process of gathering everything and kind of creating like a sort of storyline and who did they want to interview and all that sort of stuff. And I remember sitting down with one of the journalists, and very well-meaning, very intelligent people involved in creating those episodes, but had done a lot of research about court that I hadn't told her. And I just remember some of the details that she knew and that she was asking me about. And this wasn't recorded yet, thankfully, but those weren't things that I was willing to share on TV. Those weren't things that I was even talking to my family about, and they didn't even know about yet. And she had been able to get access to documents from court, whether it was a transcript or she'd found something through legal ways. I don't even know how she did it. And it was very confronting for me to sit down and to be asked those questions, because I kind of thought, okay, well, I'll have a little bit of control over this because it's my episode or whatever, but that wasn't the case. And I was really fortunate that I had some media training, and I knew that I didn't have to answer questions that I didn't want to answer. But there are so many survivors that don't have that privilege, and I know that it's an enormous privilege that I do have access to that media training. And while I've had some really good interactions with a lot of journalists, I've also had moments where I feel like they were really gotcha moments, and they were they were trying to catch me out and sort of trick me or get me to say more than I wanted to say. And I think that's something that a lot of journalists aren't very upfront with survivors about, and they'll try and get more than they can get from survivors. And we don't necessarily know without training that we're allowed to say no to those things.
Yep, great. Thanks so much, Anna. And such incredibly confronting experiences following, on top of the criminal legal process as well. And definitely something that reflects those, acknowledged, recognised pressures on journalists and media to be looking for the most sensational elements that will then, obviously, as we know, become clickbait. So we're really keen to discuss in a minute. Don't worry, it's not all just about telling media that you're doing a terrible job. We're keen to discuss in a minute what good looks like or could look like. But I just want to quickly go to Christine and then to Zita for your reflections. Just thinking about some of those really specific aspects of the criminal legal process, the prosecution process, that most people wouldn't kind of realise, thinking about why some information is more available or shared than others during that process. And Christine, you mentioned to me, the significance of victim impact statements was a great source of information, seemingly, about the experiences of the victim or their family. But the general public wouldn't know that, the whole story isn't in those statements. Do you want to kind of reflect on that?
Yeah, I think, and that's just through involvement with a family member of mine in helping her, assisting her in doing a victim impact statement because she lost her child through domestic homicide. And what, I think one of the things is that it's actually, you don't have, the freedom to express yourself how you want to express yourself. There, there are certain restrictions, there's certain guidelines. You cannot go into a lot of detail. You can talk about the impact it has on you, but it also, being able to look at if a person or if a woman was living with fear for a number of months, or and trying, and they wanted to say that this is, not the first time, this wasn't the first incident, there's a history of violence, but because the case was sort of specifically more around the incident and what occurred, wasn't able to sort of bring in a lot of that information, but also, I think, having a victim impact statement it should be from the heart, and it should be, being able to say what that impact looks like to you, what that impact was for her daughter, what she experienced while she was alive, and then since she'd passed on, what the family was experiencing. Being able to do a bit of a narrative, to be able to give the daughter a voice as well. She's no longer, no longer present, no longer here. But who is being able to give that voice to her? And I think, that's one of the things that, I just think that there's always concerns about defamation. It's about going, putting too much information in. Is it going to sentencing? Is it going to influence people? All of those things are about a legal justice system. It's not about the victim's perspective or the family's perspective. And if the person is no longer here, someone needs to be able to give them a voice as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thanks so much, Christine. I think you raising this is an incredibly important point, because I think obviously it is a very significant surprise to anybody who's not experienced in the legal system to come to the prosecution process and realise that the victim, or the complainant, as the legal system calls it, is not a party to that prosecution process. They're a witness. So already their silence, already their agency, already their decision-making role in that process is really minimised. Supposed to be consulted, doesn't always, either happen, or their views are not necessarily always taken into account. But then what happens is that there is that essentially the prosecution is about an incident, and it might be, the accused might have pleaded, in which case they pleaded to particular offences. And so what we've got then is the victim impact statement comes afterwards about the impact of those particular offences, or the things in relation to which the accused was convicted if it went to trial. And so the full story is really not shared, and I think most people would assume that that is the opportunity for victim survivors to have a voice, or their family, and it doesn't always happen. Zita, I'm going to throw to you, and just thinking also about the fact that the disadvantage and the experiences of an offender should be considered at sentencing, and its relevance is, really significant in terms of the process, but not necessarily it's not necessarily the same for the victim or survivors. And Christine has reflected already on what that looks like for Aboriginal women in particular, in terms of how they're characterised. In your experience, and I'll get you to introduce yourself when you jump into the comment, what have you observed about the way in which the offender's behaviour and background is discussed and contextualised as opposed to the victims or survivors, given that information is presented at great length to the court?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here today, and apologies for being a little bit late. I had an urgent court matter that went far longer than anticipated. I'd like to say that I agree with what Christine and Anna have mentioned and the points that they've raised in their discussion so far. For those who are joining us here, from whether you're in the media sector or you're working for a not-for-profit, I think I'd like to reiterate, if anything, if you leave today, I want you to realise that all of our professions work with words. And words are really powerful tools for creating change, for telling stories, for persuading people or providing a different perspective. And one of the things I'd really like to encourage those of you who are working in the media, either directly or indirectly with the media, is being really careful about how you interact with survivors, how you bring their stories to the forefront, and also encourage you to recognise that, particularly when we're talking about the criminal justice system, often survivors and secondary survivors get marginalised by the criminal justice process because it's viewed as being the state versus the defendant. The survivors are often like a secondary player or a spectator, even though they're the ones who've suffered the hurt, who've suffered the injustice. They're not really, I'm going to be quite blunt, they're not considered to really be an active participant in the process. And so many of the systems that we've got in place reinforce the subjugation of the victim in that criminal justice process. As Christine's mentioned, victim impact statements, even though they're meant to be really powerful tools that allow victims, their supporters, secondary victims, to be able to share their experiences, their stories with the court, often there are so many restrictions about what they can say, how they can say how they're feeling. So it's a very, how would you call it? It's a very artificial story of that victim survivor's experiences. And often having written them for clients and then getting feedback from prosecution, no, you can't put that in there, you got to take this out. Often really what victim survivors would like you to hear and would like to convey to the court about what the actions of perpetrators has had on them, their families, children who are involved, is not really conveyed. That is often lost in the process. And I think one of the things that journalists can do, or anybody involved in the media, is try and bring that to the forefront in terms of how you engage with victim survivors, making sure that, A, they're informed about what they can agree to discuss with you, and also getting them involved in how they present that information, how that information is presented, to ensure that you're actually bringing forth an accurate representation of their experiences. But I also wanted to expand a little bit about what Christine has highlighted about some of the challenges for victims who are not considered to be the perfect victim, whether that's because they're survivors who are living with disabilities, whether they're survivors who may be working in industries that are considered to be dubious or have negative connotations, whether there also could be survivors who are from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. The way in which stories are presented about those who are not considered to be the perfect victims can have a significant impact, not just on that victim, but also on others from those communities who may be thinking of reaching out and getting help. And I'd like to touch on, as a woman from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, about a story that I heard from a young woman who reached out to a sexual assault service for help. Whilst this was not in the media, but her experience, I think, highlights some of the issues that women from diverse backgrounds grapple with when they're dealing with the criminal justice system and the media portrayal of their stories, is that when she went in to get a service, she felt like she was some sort of exotic animal or some sort of exotic case. She felt that her agency as a person had been stripped and she'd been reduced to this kind of interesting case study. And for a lot of women from diverse backgrounds, particularly when you've got cultural considerations that come into the fray, sometimes those women are actually more reluctant to engage with the criminal justice system and, by extension, the media system, because not only do they go through the trauma of having to relive what they've gone through, but their community in turn is further stigmatized. They're further labelled as being the other, and they feel that they're further denigrated by the very system that should be protecting them.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Zita. And I think so the two kind of themes that are coming out for me are essentially about the media developing greater capacity and capability to report and describe domestic, family or sexual violence more generally, be aware of the patterns, be aware of the nuances and complexities, so that when writing about a case, whether or not there is a victim survivor voice involved, those broader systemic issues and patterns can be kind of understood, and the victim survivors not represented in a particularly negative way. And then we've got also the opportunities that lie in what does it look like in the unusual, admittedly, situations where the media is able to work with and engage with a victim survivor and or their family to represent that story, even if it's not during, potentially afterwards. And so I just wanted to turn to each of you kind of thinking about what are the key ingredients when that occurs. What does that look like for a productive approach that is not going to deter more victim survivors from reporting, let alone engaging with the media? Christine, I'm going to throw to you first. We talked about a particular experience that you had where you saw negative examples, but you also saw a positive example in which a survivor that you were working with and family had felt that there was a kind of positive representation of their experience in the media. What were the key ingredients to that?
I think that some of the ingredients to that were that the media person or the journalist reached out to the family. They reached out and asked if they were happy to meet with them, to have conversations about what happened, to feed into giving that narrative from that victim's perspective, but also talking about the experience as a Aboriginal woman going through a system where she was able to talk about her daughter and to let people know what her daughter was like, to give her daughter a story about that she was a beautiful young woman that grew up and met this guy that was really violent and was able to give that background, that history about her daughter, but also to talk about being able to speak about the violence that occurs in communities, like, you know, with Aboriginal women, and how she felt her daughter was disregarded, had a lack of response, talking about those issues, those systemic issues that happen within society, particularly within the justice system, being able to talk about them. And I think there's also another matter, and there was another matter with another. So what she did in particular was that the journalist actually got that woman's phone number and was able to communicate with her directly. Like I said, meet with her directly, do a little interview with her on camera. But she followed the court case as well, and she attended the court hearing so that she actually listened to what happened, and then she followed up after it to see how she felt and if she was satisfied with the outcome. I mean, no one can be satisfied, but to a certain extent, how she felt about the outcome. But she also got my number to be able to contact me as well, so that if the mum wasn't available, she could go through me to do that. So it's about looking at who's available. And I've seen that happen with another case as well, where a journalist reached out to the community to try to find out more information about an incident where an Aboriginal woman was killed, another situation where she was killed by a non-Aboriginal partner. And the case was pretty much got no recognition until it went through the media. And the media were the ones that actually put it on the front page, put it on TV, to the point that the DPP had to actually lay charges. So the media can actually do a lot of really good in this space, but it can also do, some detrimental work as well. And it depends on how good the media is in doing that. But I do think, having a community, contacting family, contacting community is really important to get the stories from the people that are involved.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Christine. And as Anna, as someone who's had that experience of having somebody work on, stories in relation to your experience and seeing it potentially with other survivors who you support through the Survivor Hub, what are the key ingredients, even when that contact occurs, thinking about, time and agency in particular? What are the sort of some of the key ingredients of potentially a successful interaction in that regard?
So I want to start answering that by jumping back really quickly to what Christine and Zita had said earlier about the court process and how impersonal it is, and how emotions are removed, and the process of the victim impact statements. And I had a similar experience, had pages cut from mine because it wasn't allowed. And I just think the legal system, it deliberately removes emotion. It's deliberately impersonal. They say that it's fair. It's not fair. They fear our anger. They fear victim survivors' anger. And I just think the way that I think about that is, why can't we be angry? Because we've been harmed and we deserve anger, and we have a right to our anger. And sometimes anger is a really important part of the healing and recovery process. And something that I think that good journalists can do well, and media can do well, is give that people access to their anger, and give people access to storytelling in the way that they want to do it, that cannot frankly happen in the court process because of all of the rules around what you can and cannot say in victim impact statements, and how fraught that process is, and how much is removed. And then is removing part of a victim impact statement isn't not just silencing of a victim survivor's experience. And something that's really important about that we should remember about sexual, domestic and family violence is that at the core of it, it's agency being removed from survivors. And one of the most important aspects of the healing process, if not the most important, is that survivors can regain their agency and their autonomy in decision making in things that are, concerning them and their healing and recovery process. And for some people, that is accessing and going through media and telling their story in a way that they want to tell it, and that a way that isn't, so heavily silenced by the legal and reporting process. And then I guess something else, some of the other, you asked the ingredients of good journalism, is I can remember the names and the media articles or podcasts or whatever it was, radio interviews of every single good journalist that I've ever spoken to, and I've done quite a lot of media now, and I know all of the ones that did a really good job, and for me it was a really important sort of kickstart for my healing and recovery journey. And actually a journalist was the first person I spoke to before any of the legal and reporting process or anything like that, and I did an anonymous interview really early on with a really, really fantastic journalist. And for me, that was a really kind of turning point in my healing and recovery process, because it was the first time I'd spoken about it in a way that I wanted to speak about it. And it was the first time that I kind of even called myself a survivor, especially because I was so young, and I had all sorts of kind of misunderstandings of what it was to experience domestic violence when you are so young, and sort of just didn't know whether I was a survivor. I didn't know that I was a survivor. And so I think, you know, I want media who are here to know that they can play a really, really important pivotal role in a survivor's healing and recovery process if they do it kindly and they do it properly, and they do it, you know, telling victim survivors our rights and what we can and can't, and, you know, don't have to share if we don't want to, and that, you know, nobody has a right to our story and any parts of it, and that we can choose what we'd like to share and what we wouldn't like to share, and if we want to do it anonymously, we can do it anonymously, and things like that. So yeah, I just want to, I know that it's kind of been negative until now, but there's, you know, there's a really positive role that journalists can play, you know, as Christine said as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. Thanks, Anna. And I think one of the, certainly as a researcher who works with both participants and colleagues with particular experiences, one of the, you know, positive aspects to engagement with media is when we can have a conversation about the survivor having the ultimate approval of that piece. And seeing what's going to be in, what's going to be out before it either goes to air or goes to print. I just wondered whether any of you have had experiences with being able to kind of essentially have that veto, or see people that you're supporting have that veto, and to what extent you're aware of the pressures, you know, that we acknowledge are on media from sub-editors and editors to shape things in certain ways. Is that a conversation that you've been able to have sort of towards the end point as well as during the engagement? I'll just throw it open. Zita?
I'd be happy to jump in. I've had some, as Anna and Christine have alluded, there are some really great journalists out there who do amazing work with survivors. And I'm just echoing what Christine and Anna have said. I think the key thing is about being transparent and respectful towards the survivor. If you can remember those two things, that would greatly assist in ensuring that the survivor has a good experience and is not further traumatized by interactions with either yourself or your team. But in terms of journalists being open and transparent with survivors in terms of what is going to be covered in the media piece, ensuring that the survivor has the opportunity to be able to say those things that they want, to remove those things that they don't want included in there, that they have the option to be anonymous, or to remove key identifying information. Ensuring that survivors have those things ensures that they're protected during that process. And I think once survivors feel comfortable, they will be able to provide you with a much more richer and much more deeper interaction that will influence the quality of the work that you're able to produce as somebody who's engaged with the media. And the other thing I'd also recommend is follow-up. So after you've finished working with the survivor or survivors, it only takes about, a quick 10-minute phone call, 5, 10, 15-minute phone call to just check in with the survivor after the work's been completed, released in whatever form that is, whether that's a interview, print media, to just check in and follow up. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, with a client that we assisted, that I was involved in that interaction with as a third party, if you want to call it, with the media, she had an amazing outcome that came out from telling her story, and being able to feed that back into for the journalists to be able to hear about that outcome firsthand, I think was really a good experience for both parties. And so I do encourage you to have some follow-up as well. I know you're all very busy and there's so many competing demands and, you know, deadlines and timelines, but a lot of these relationships that you build with survivors will serve you well, particularly if you're interested in, say, for example, court reporting, etc., because a lot of these survivors have networks that might become useful to you later on. So if you cultivate these relationships, look after these relationships, they'll serve you well, not just for this particular piece that you're writing on, but in the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, Zita. And, you know, I would echo that in terms of somebody who supports survivors. Those good relationships and experiences mean that we're aware of who we're going to kind of consider requests from and connecting participants with because of the way in which it's something in a previous example has been handled, and we're very aware of bad examples, and there ain't no second chances when you're a practitioner or an advocate who's supporting a survivor or their family. You're not going to risk, you know, a negative experience again. So it's an investment of that time, isn't it? I couldn't agree more. There has been a question, I'm conscious of time, we're going to wrap up in a little bit, and one of the questions that has come through is about the role of survivor advocates. And I think that's a really interesting one, because I know we recognise that there's a lot of pressure on media to, you know, if they're going to run a story, there needs to be what media often frame, to me, certainly in their requests, as a case study, i.e. somebody with direct experience, and either of that particular issue or a particular case or more broadly. And sometimes it's really hard. There's a bit of a push-pull. We're trying to essentially ensure that people are safe and not re-traumatized by that experience. But obviously you want the story and the issues to be highlighted. What's your kind of advice there in terms of using or connecting with survivor advocates and the importance of getting that lived experience context, even if it's not the direct person directly involved? Christine, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's really important because the victim's perspective puts that light on it. It gives that narrative, it gives that really sensitive approach. And I think it's really important that you hear from people that have, that have that knowledge, because we need to report the truth. And what is reported is in black and white, and it can be there forever. If, it can be online, it can be wherever. So I think there's a real responsibility, a real accountability to actually speak to women with lived experience, or people with lived experience, but also the victim advocates, being able to understand what those nuances are, what the issues are, understanding how to approach situations. Also, I think we're always learning, so it's always useful to reach out and to get some guidance about how to do this kind of work if you don't know it, if you don't feel comfortable with it. And I think everyone that's an advocate is always willing to share and to inform other people about how to do this work and how to approach situations like this, because we want the best outcomes for victims and we want the best outcomes for their families as well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Christine. And Anna, I think drawing on your reflections also, there's another question come through. Is working together with a survivor who's particularly the focus of the story on conversation topics ahead of the interview, or having them suggest points that they'd like to talk, is that a useful approach too?
Yeah, I think the best media interactions I've ever had have been with journalists who have spoken to me before, like some really, really good journalists, and I know that they're busy, will even call me and have a kind of pre-chat, talk about kind of what I know, what I'm comfortable talking about, all of that. And that's completely off the record, which means that it's safe for me to be able to share that. And as Zita said, they get a better story when they do that sort of thing, because I know that I'm safe to be able to share. And that kind of that pre-chat before is so important. And yeah, working kind of as much as they can within their editorial kind of control power. I know that there's rules around that. Working with the survivor is really important. And like I've had some horror stories where it hasn't been done properly, and the result of that is just devastating. You know, to think that you're safe to share something and then to have that not turn out the way that you thought it was going to turn out, and you know, even to feel misrepresented on something that is so you know, intimate and personal and traumatizing, an experience of sexual, domestic and family violence in the court process afterwards, and then to have that misrepresented when you feel like you could have trusted that person and you wanted to share your story, is really devastating. So it's really important that it's done properly.
Yep, fantastic. Thank you so much to everybody on this call. You're all legends, and bring such expertise and experience and just kind of depth of that experience too over many years, and being able to observe the different approaches that work and which do harm. We know that, you know, the media doesn't go into the fray seeking to do harm, often seeking to convey what's been occurring and the significance of gender-based violence, with the best of intentions. But it sounds like, if I can sum up, the approaches that involve really getting into and learning about the patterns of not only of domestic, family and sexual violence, but what that looks like for different cohorts in the community, and the language, being really, really considered about the language that is used to describe stories when we're talking about people, making assumptions about people, and then thinking when working with survivors, being able to inject time into it. And we know there's a tension there with the profession in which everyone is working, but that's as much about a sort of educative piece to editors and sub-editors about the fact that, as Zita has said, as Anna said, as Christine said, when you invest time and care, you're not only going to get a better story like that particular instance, but you're much more likely to get more access and more engagement over the longer term, not only to the benefit of your particular deadlines, but in ways that can contribute to survivor healing, as Anna has described, and to increased reporting and investigation and prosecution of gender-based violence, which can prevent violence from happening in the future, which is what we're all about and what Our Watch is about too. So I want to thank you, in particular Our Watch, for hosting today, and many, many thanks to our awesome panel. Thanks for joining us, everybody.